Okay.
What I thought I'd do is start with India maybe, and then towards the end say something about fascism in a more theoretical way. I don't believe that the left, the revolutionary left, has developed a proper understanding of fascism or a theory of fascism. It tends to kind of, obviously for correct reasons, reject the Comintern's characterization of fascism as an incarnation of finance capital, which was the theory that Dimitrov put forward in the early 30s. But in terms of an alternative understanding of fascism, a lot of the left in Britain at least falls back on Trotsky's writings, and I'm not sure that that's fair on Trotsky, because Trotsky wasn't actually developing a theory of fascism. He was actively intervening to suggest ways of sort of creating some kind of opposition to fascism in Germany. So I'll start with India. In 2014, I think, the right-wing party called the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, came to power with what it claimed was a substantial mandate. In fact, it got 31% of the vote, which is not a substantial mandate. It was the lowest percentage polled by any party that had won the national, that's the Lok Sabha election in India. But together with its allies, it made up to about 40% of the electorate. It sort of garnered 40% of the vote. Now, behind the BJP stands an organization called the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which constantly rejects the definition or the characterization of itself as a political organization. It says it's strictly cultural. And the RSS goes back to 1925. It was founded by, among others, someone called Hegdewar, K.B. Hegdewar, who in turn was a protege. From childhood, he was a protege of someone called Munje. And the reason I start like this is that I think, in terms of the debate that's going on the Indian left today, about whether or not we're dealing with fascism in India today, it's important to start with the historical links between the RSS and the European fascists. And there are three levels at which we can discuss the RSS. The first is those links themselves. Secondly, its stated objectives as a network of organizations. And thirdly, the kind of methods it uses to create a mass base, a political mass base in India, and it certainly has a very substantial mass base. If you want a counterpart to the RSS in the Muslim world, it would be the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. What's similar to between them, so to speak, the element of commonality is that they have both worked solidly and systematically for decades together at a grassroots level. They both emphasize outreach, that's religious outreach and social services. So they've created a massive kind of network at grassroots level, which no section of the left can possibly match. And in that sense, in that particular well-defined sense, they have a kind of hegemony at a grassroots level. The difference, the crucial difference between the Muslim Brotherhood and the RSS is that the Brotherhood is schizophrenic about electoral politics. It was torn apart by a debate in the 90s about whether or not it should float a parliamentary party. There was strong resistance from the old guard, and the young elements, the kind of more technical, professional, qualified middle-class elements within the Brotherhood split and formed a separate party because the old guard in the Brotherhood refused to float a political party. And of course, as we know from the last few years and so on, since 2011, they've been contesting elections. In India, the RSS does not contest elections. It's the shadow behind the BJP. The BJP is often called the mask of the RSS, the mukhota of the RSS. It's just the parliamentary face of the RSS. So there's a kind of duality in Indian politics, a division of labor. The BJP is the parliamentary face of a movement or a network of organizations, massive network of organizations called the RSS, which is the kind of controlling body. It drives the whole agenda. Now Munje, who was the guy who sort of brought Hegdewar into politics and so on, Hegdewar is one of the founders of the RSS, and he was the first Sarsang Chalak, that means Supremo, kind of the top man in the RSS. He was the first one. Munje sought an appointment with Mussolini in 1931, and Mussolini granted him 45 minutes. He was traveling through the country, visiting various academies in fascist Italy and so on. He was very impressed by one particular aspect of the regime in Italy, which was their emphasis on youth, on the paramilitary training of youth. And when he did finally meet Mussolini for something like an interview of 45 minutes, Il Duce asks him, what is it that impresses you? You've come to Italy and so on. What is it that impresses you about us? And Munje says, the way you've actually inducted youth into your fascist political culture and the kind of training you've subjected them to. He was referring, of course, to these fascist youth organizations, which were called, I think, the Balila, yeah? Anyway, when Munje went back, the first thing he did was, remember this is 1931, the first thing he did was revamp the entire kind of RSS network and start something called the Shaka. The Shaka, it's just a word which means branch. And so they started this series of branches which were effectively meant to be replicating the Italian model of paramilitary fascist youth organizations. And today, the number of Shakas in the country just countless, absolutely, staggering number of Shakas throughout the country, essentially aimed at recruiting youth into the ideology and the politics of the RSS. In terms of their stated objective, they want a Hindu state in India, just as the religious right in the Muslim world talks about wanting to bring about an Islamic state, which essentially in their case means something based on the Sharia. The RSS likewise wants a Hindu state in India. And in terms of exactly what the Hindu state will mean, it's not at all clear. I mean, they don't spell out the concrete features of it, but we've already begun to see a foretaste of what it might mean. For example, the consumption of beef has been banned in several states in India, including the one I live in, which is Maharashtra. I used to eat beef on a regular basis. My diet has been changed. I can't, because they won't supply it. I mean, it's illegal to supply beef, so I can't consume it. That's already a personal liberty of mine, which has been restricted in a very palpable way. And then you've had a kind of culture of mass violence in terms of targeting Muslims who are accused of trading in beef or having something to do with livestock. We've had a whole spate of lynchings, especially since 2015. So, this utopia of a Hindu state has never clearly spelled out, but it's basically currently a license to the kind of the kind of lumpen organizations connected with the RSS to do what they like at a more local level. The key thing about the RSS is its ability to actually create a mass base through a kind of xenophobic religious nationalism, which is also the ideology of the parliamentary wing of the RSS, which is the BJP. Modi, in that sense, is a figurehead. He's only a symbol of something much bigger. I don't think Modi calls the shots. I mean, that's a controversial statement to make, but I don't think he calls the shots. I think the RSS is calling the shots. There was some tension between the RSS top man, the current Sarsanghcha man called Bhagwat, and Modi some time back, but that's been resolved. Modi's very keen on foreign investments in India. The RSS tends to be very suspicious of a substantial foreign presence of any type in the country. So the kind of features that I would associate with RSS politics would be, first of all, when the BJP contests elections and actually comes to power through elections and so on, what kind of commitment to democracy are we talking about? This is also relevant in terms of Islamic parties which are now being won over to what's called post-Islamism, namely contesting elections in countries like Tunisia and Egypt and so on. What are we talking about when they actually contest parties? When these parties contest elections, it's a purely instrumental conception of democracy. The idea is to be able to use democracy as a system to hasten its demise. So you actually undermine democracy from the inside. One way of doing that is if you win elections and you're in power with what you claim is a substantial mandate, then the deep penetration of the state apparatus itself becomes much easier. And the RSS is today kind of moved at rapid speed since 2014 to fill crucial positions within the state apparatus. Anyway, the police and the army to some extent have been deeply penetrated by the RSS, but all kinds of other institutions, especially of education and culture. The most radical left-leaning university in the country now has an RSS vice-chancellor, which is JNU in Delhi, which has also been the battleground for a lot of conflict between the students there and the administration, the vice-chancellor. But this deep penetration of the state is not something that has just started in 2014 since their victory. It's been going on for some time. What would one mean by saying that it's a purely instrumental conception of democracy? What I mean is that they're obviously not committed to democracy as the heart of a, of the kind of legacy, of the modernist legacies that capitalism has given to the world since the 18th century, let's say since the Enlightenment. They're not committed to democracy in that more fundamental sense of seeing it as the essence, as the very basis of modern society. And if anything, even in terms of their program for a Hindu state, that would be irreconcilable with democracy of any type. So clearly it's a purely formal, instrumental use of democracy or notion of democracy. I referred to this kind of xenophobic religious nationalism. The nation itself becomes a kind of deity in the iconography and the rhetoric of the Hindu right in India. The nation is a god. So she's called Bharat Mata, right? And Bharat Mata Ki Jai is the kind of standard right-wing slogan in India. So there's a kind of powerful fusion of religious symbolism and of nationalism. So it's a pure model of religious nationalism. The iconography depicts a deity, kind of very clearly drawn from kind of Hindu mythology and so on. But the nation is then deified, and this kind of strand of nationalism has become quite strident in the last 2.5, 3 years. The other thing is the targeting of minorities is clearly very conscious. It's strategic. The idea is to generate support repeatedly, to generate, on an almost cyclical basis, to generate a culture of fear and intimidation among minorities and mobilize mass support from, the hardcore Hindu right, so to speak. That's a fluid relationship. There are periods when it's worse and periods when it declines. But I think the key thing to understand about the strength, the resilience of this kind of religious right in India is the background, which is why I told Duncan when he asked me to talk that I'd much rather have a title like Fascism, Culture and Ideology, because I think the key lesson you take away from India, and also from Nazi Germany in many ways, is the predisposition of particular kinds of political culture towards fascism, so to speak. While you can't call those particular cultures fascist in themselves, a political culture with a strong sense of nationalism of some sort or other, especially a traumatized nationalism of the sort that the Germans suffered from following their defeat in the First War, is what I mean by one of the ingredients of a fascist political culture. The two thinkers or writers in the left tradition who came closest to understanding this dynamic of fascism are Arthur Rosenberg and Wilhelm Reich. And the first two chapters of Reich's Mass Psychology of Fascism are just fabulous. They're really important. I think the rest of it sort of tends to go off track because Reich is, he insists on kind of bringing psychoanalysis into it in a way that dominates the argument later on. But the first two chapters are very important because here authoritarianism becomes absolutely central to the argument. And Reich's essential argument is that the mainstay of the state in capitalist society is the family. So this is a way of integrating feminist politics with the politics of the left and of the socialist left. So the kind of divisions and dichotomies melt away in some ways, because the idea of the family, in particular of the authoritarian family as the basis of the capitalist state, first of all implies that the capitalist state tends to be an authoritarian state anyway. So even if fascism emerges out of it in some ways, there is a mutation of the capitalist state, it tends to be authoritarian. I mean, the kind of whole idea of subordinating labor to capital is itself intrinsically authoritarian. The wage-labor relationship, despite the formal appearance of a contract, is an intrinsically, essentially kind of unequal relationship. But Reich wants to argue that the family is where ideology most effectively emerges as a material force. So Reich's idea of ideology is not something mental, ideal, purely spiritual and so on. It's something very material in the sense that it has concrete influences on politics. It shapes politics in concrete material ways. And he put particular emphasis on cultures of sexual repression, domination and control. What you, broadly speaking, can call patriarchy, and thought that they were absolutely crucial to the success of fascism. All of this is relevant to India because, I mean, you know, India is a society where, you know, in many senses, at a completely pre-modern stage in terms of its understanding of sexuality, its ability to handle sexuality. So these cultures of sexual repression and domination are, you know, widespread in the country, and they take the form of honor killings, of the ability to, you know, of the kind of drive to control relationships between young people, the refusal to let young women in particular make choices of their own, personal choices of their own, and the refusal to allow anything like an even vaguely emancipated sexual culture to emerge in the country. Then there is a profound tradition of social conservatism in India which is linked to the caste system. And caste is not a survival from the past, it's something that's received dynamism from mass politics. It's been revitalized by mass politics in the 20th century. It would be wrong to see caste as something which simply survives. It's not a residue. It plays a role in the current political culture and system of India. And the social conservatism that's bound up with caste should be obvious. I mean, it sort of implies a naked system of bondage, of hierarchy, of the subjugation of large groups of people to what the Hindus regard as a sort of sacred part of their own history and culture and religion. And apart from the lynching of Muslims suspected or accused of dealing in livestock and so on, you've also had violence being unleashed against Dalits, you know, quote unquote the scheduled castes. One of the worst atrocities of this sort happened in Gujarat, which is the state that Modi ruled over as chief minister. I haven't mentioned what happened in Gujarat in 2002. Since I bring up Gujarat, I may as well just rapidly say that something like well over 1,000 Muslims were massacred in broad daylight over a spree of violence that lasted several weeks. Well over 1,000. 1,000 is a conservative estimate. And the ostensible pretext for this backlash was that a train carrying Hindu car sevaks, that sort of religious activists traveling back from North India, was set fire to by again, allegedly by Muslims at a particular railway station called Godhra. That incident, the train being burnt at Godhra station, sparked this spree of violence which took the form of a kind of unrestrained genocide, essentially, because it was targeting Muslims and involved horrific atrocities, mass rapes, gang rapes, and of course murders and so on. And Modi was the chief minister in the state at the time, and at a infamous meeting that took place on the evening prior to the actual explosion of violence, the DIG, that's the top police official of Gujarat, said that he wasn't willing to let the cops simply stand aside. But Modi told him to shut up, basically, the man called Chakravarti. Modi told him to shut up. That's how it was reported just 3 days later in the newspapers. So it's not something that was fabricated years later. It was reported in the newspapers at the time just 3 days later. He got very angry. He told this guy to shut up. He said, we need 3 days. We need something like 48 hours or a bit more than that to let the Hindus vent their anger, was how Modi put it. From this stems the long-standing campaign of Modi's kind of role, his responsibility in the violence in 2002, his complicity or whatever in that violence. Okay. So I think I'll just wrap up there. I'm not sure I've been able to convey the argument essentially, but I think in terms of an understanding of fascism, the kind of culture, the kind of cultural background that allows certain sorts of authoritarianism to emerge and then dominate is absolutely crucial.
Thank you very much.
I'll be speaking about the Western far right, as it were. Broadly, I'll be talking about parties in Britain, America, and France. But my focus isn't going to be on them as individual parties, but as a totality, the far right as a whole. And I'll start just with my definition for tonight of what I mean by the far right. It seems to me that what's happened, particularly in the last years, is that in practice there's been a convergence between two different sorts of political tradition. There's been a convergence between people who come from, broadly speaking, conservative tradition, and people who come, broadly speaking, from a fascist tradition. That does not mean that all conservatives have been part of that journey. You can find lots of conservatives who take a different position. Nor actually does it mean that all fascists in Western Europe signed up to it as well. But significant chunks of what we used to regard as fascism 2 or 3 years ago, significant chunks of what we used to regard as conservatism, are in practice operating right now as if they are representatives of a single party with a shared programme, a shared set of goals. So what I want to start off is, in a sense, by making good that point, that there has been this process of convergence, that it's something that's new, that it's something different, that wasn't part of our politics 2 or 3 years ago. So I just want to go through some facts. As I go through them, a number of these will be alluding to things which will be familiar to people in the room. But I'm starting off by describing this process of convergence. Think back to a year ago when we had the Brexit vote. The first two major politicians to say that they supported Brexit, that Brexit endorsed their politics and proved they were right, were Trump and Marine Le Pen. On Trump's victory, you recall how in the weeks leading up to Trump's victory, our beloved little Nigel Farage was making every possible tour of studios in America. Trump invited him after his victory to come see his golden elevator. Before he'd met Trump, before Trump had even gone to the extent of phoning Theresa May. Farage gave a very interesting interview immediately after the Trump victory, and he was asked, what's it that connects Brexit and Trump? And he said, you need to understand both of these have been counter-revolution elections. That was the phrase he used. In the run-up to the French presidential elections, those of you who, for whatever reason, log on to the far-right website Breitbart in the States, its chair used to be a man called Steve Bannon, who of course is now Trump's chief of staff, will have seen that for a process of weeks and weeks and weeks, every single day, Breitbart was running a positive news story about Le Pen, how she was way ahead in the polls, how young people were flocking to her in the tens of thousands, how she was the best candidate. Endorsement moved up the food chain in American politics. Eventually, Trump himself described Le Pen as the best candidate on what's going on in France, was the phrase he used. It's slightly equivocal endorsement, but in reality, an endorsement. So far I've been describing a process of sort of international collaboration, of people from different countries saying, one person will support them, even though the people involved in this process are people who come from different traditions. Le Pen, her party was set up as a fascist party, her father was a recognisably fascist politician. She's plainly a very different sort of politician, or she used to be a very different sort of politician from Farage or Trump. Trump, the Republican who once upon a time was a Democrat. But they're all working together, treating each other as if they were representatives of the same party. It's a process which hasn't merely been taken, as it were, internationally across borders, but also takes place within borders. In the second round of the French presidential elections, amongst the people who endorsed Marine Le Pen and said they were going to vote for her, was a man called Nicolas Dupont-Aignan, who was a Gaullist politician, who'd stood in the first round of elections as a candidate in his own right, and won 5% of the vote. In the second round, he endorsed Le Pen, and Le Pen said, because you've endorsed me, if I win, I'll make you my Prime Minister. So there's a sense within each country also of convergence. And there's also beneath this process of, in a sense of mutual pushing forward and encouragement and endorsing, there's also a process behind that of a degree of ideological convergence, which obviously is beneath that and justifies that. So you see Trump choosing Steve Bannon as his chief of staff. That's not the only Trump appointment. He's not chosen a cabinet which is only made up of people from the far right. But he's content to go along with that, content to go along with all the policies, the Muslim ban, the Mexican war, etc., 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 which are all policies which are beyond the pale of what was considered acceptable conservative politics a year ago. Here in Britain, we've had UKIP electing new leader Paul Nuttall. It doesn't take very hard to read in Paul Nuttall's speeches and find him endorsing figures from the recognisable fascism. He's given speeches operating admittedly to a degree of code and code language, but referencing people like Nick Griffin, Anders Breivik, referencing them approvingly and agreeing with their ideas. But the point about convergence, perhaps here I'm striking a slightly different note from Jairus. One of the points about convergence, particularly if you see convergence in terms of what's happening to people who've emerged within a fascist tradition, is that, of course, while conservatives are in a sense moving towards fascism, there's also an element of which people from historically fascist parties are converging at a point which is closer to conservatism than the point at which they started. And this again was an issue in the French elections. And the day after Marine Le Pen did so well in the second round, got 40% of the vote, 35%, and did so well. The very next day, her father, who'd bankrolled the campaign, who'd lent her €6 million to make the campaign possible, denounced her in the press and made a great deal of making these criticisms public. There was a degree of code behind his criticism, but the unspoken message was, you ran a campaign which is too much like a conventional campaign. It wasn't different enough. It wasn't like the old Front National. You've changed. You've moved too far in the direction of conservatism. So we see convergence. It's not a one-way process. It's a process which involves both these traditions, parts of both these traditions, moving together. Now, what I want to do is try and think through, can we think about this process of a far-right emerging, being coherent, stabilising, and so converging at this point between fascism and conservatism? Are there elements, again, rather like Jairus, trying to think more analytically, theoretically, are there ideas behind this which we can use to try and explain what's going on? Now, the most usual idea that we encounter in the press most often, the phrase you most often hear is this word populist. And personally, whenever I hear the word populist, a distinctive feeling of revulsion of it, because it seems to be behind the notion of populist is this kind of neoliberal idea. It's absolutely terrible when you have politicians who appeal to the people and want to get elected. This populism is somehow a bad thing. And so the instinctive response to populism is generally to say, distrust the approach. There's a more sophisticated take on populism, however, which I think is worth sharing, because I think it does have a partial insight, and it's this. Populism is a paradoxical idea. The most basic belief of a populist is that they incarnate the desires of the people. The people and the elected leader are one. Every person supports the leader, and the leader leads in the interests of absolutely everybody. Now, plainly one thing which emerges from that as an idea, this unity between the leadership and the mass of the people, what happens then when you have to deal with dissent? And one of the basic ideas, and I think this is a point at which populism is to some extent a useful idea, is that populists cannot process dissent. Populists process dissent by saying that the people who are dissenting are not part of the people. They're deprived any right because they're not signing up to a people which is behind the populist leader. And populists, in other words, because they don't really believe in the humanity of the people who disagree with them, are inherently suspicious, vulnerable to conspiracy theory, and authoritarian, which at least is a fair characterisation of Donald Trump, I think. But again, distrust the approach, populists dislike it as an approach. It hides too much. It hides too much about whether the populism is of left origin, is of right origin, whether it's populism that's going fast in the direction of authoritarianism or more slowly. And it's the inheritor of older terms, totalitarian, which shared that same ultimately confusing and concealing characteristic. The next approach is to talk about people who are described as far-right as if they're fascists. And some reasons, again, why I personally disagree with that. The first one is I think that when Marxists use the word fascism, there is a temptation for this to be a kind of approach towards new movements as they emerge, which is to assume that they operate under the rules of something from the past, and to try and annex the experiences of new social phenomenon to ideas from the past. Now, there can be times when that's exactly right, but as an instinct, it's an instinct which is profoundly debilitating. It's been repeatedly debilitating for the left. Jairus gave lots of examples of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I'm someone who, for my sins, have read both in English and in Arabic the political analyses generated by the left in 1940s Egypt about the Muslim Brotherhood, not when it emerged, but after, when it was first seriously contending for power. And they sort of oscillated between basically seeing this entirely progressive force, it was the bourgeoisie going in a new and decent direction, to its fascism, and kind of leapt from one to the other without finding a creative, actual, positive, and analytical, useful analytical point in between. There's another point why I think it's a mistake to see the events of the last year and use the word term fascism to describe them. What our present crisis shares with the crisis of the 1920s is it is essentially an economic crisis. The Wall Street crash, 40 million unemployed in America, vast tens of millions in Germany, compared to the present in Britain, the longest period of decline in working class living standards since records are capable of being constructed retrospectively in the 1790s. This economic crisis creates a similarity, but there are differences. Fascism emerges in a world which is in two crucial respects different from our present world. The first one is it's a post-war world. How do you get, let alone the Italian youth organisations of the 30s, how do you get these ex-student mass combat organisations wandering around Germany and Italy in the post-World War and suddenly having 100,000 members and suddenly having guns and being able to go into the local socialist centres and local trade union centres and just kill everyone in them and close them down, long before fascism even takes power? One of the things that makes this possible is it's just after the end of the First World War. There are millions and millions of people with guns. That means that when fascism emerges, that it has a potentiality in that crisis, which any ideology in the present day doesn't have to the same extent. There's another point of difference, and it's this. Fascism emerges after and sets itself up the task of defeating the Russian Revolution. Now let's be honest with ourselves. In the Europe of the 1920s, the revolution was a major player in politics. So they say, we are one of the 2 or 3 main powers and main choices available to millions of people. It's very hard, if we're honest to ourselves today, to look at the world and say, well, with Trump, he's facing this Bolshevik seizure of power, and that's the counter-revolution, fascism's counter-revolution that he's aiming against. And there's another reason why I'd argue against the term fascism for the present. If I'm right in my description of what's happening between fascism and conservatism, i.e. a degree of parties from different traditions converging, finding an opportunity in the same political space, then by definition that's not fascism. That's something moving away from fascism and something moving away from conservatism. But it's not pure and simple fascism in the way that people might understand. Now, all that said, if we have an idea that the far right today is not fascist, and at the very most, by even using terms like fascism, we're using them, as it were, by analogy, is there any sense at all in which we can look back at that period and at least learn some lessons for today, which might help us to make sense of the movements in front of us in the US and in Europe? And this will be the last main point that I make. But within it, a couple of points. First of all, one of the things that's useful if you focus on the actual history of fascism, one of the things it reminds you is that political traditions don't emerge fully formed. If it's true that in 10 or 20 years' time we're still going to be looking back at this period and talking about Trumpism or populism or whatever it's called as something new and significant which changed politics in a way, we shouldn't think that it's going to start off and that it's already at the point that it's going to reach after a period of time. Neither Italian fascism nor German fascism emerged with a programme which was at all similar to the programme under which they governed. There were programmes chosen by the Italian fascists within days of their first meetings. One of their defining goals was they insisted that Italian fascism for its future and for all time would be a Republican party. It would demand the abolition of the Italian monarchy. Well, Mussolini governed quite happily for 20 years with the Italian monarchy. In a key crisis, it was actually his main crutch. Fascism was a movement that could treat ideas relatively opportunistically, and its destination is to some extent only apparent after it's been existent for 10 or 12 years. It may well be, again, that when we look back at the new ideas of the present, there's something similar to them about this. Another thing fascism reminds us is that politics doesn't always converge at the centre. For a very long time, particularly on the left, our whole historical imagination has been dominated by all these terrible traditions, which all started off at one stage promising the earth, and at then another point were converging on the centre ground of politics. Socialism, 1890s, Marxist, revolutionary. By around 1914, 1918, you choose your date, had in essence made peace with capitalism. The communism of the 1930s and 1940s becomes a Euro-communism in the 60s, it makes peace. even in America, a much more pressing process for activists to deal with. It's the whole phenomenon first of the Clinton presidencies, and then, ye gods, even more so, the Obama presidencies, which come in with that enormous sense of unfulfilled ambition and leave with millions of Americans feeling that nothing economically changed. You know, the bank deal stayed, all the bad things that made people's lives so terrible were all still there. Now, in terms of fascist radicalisation, fascism was that rare thing, a right-wing politics which radicalised in power. I'm talking about two aspects of that radicalisation which are relevant to today. First one's this. One of the things which enabled fascism to move continuously to the right from its starting point was there was a process whereby different fascist leaders in different countries were watching each other, competing. If one achieved a victory, the second saw it and then tried to overreach the first. So you see Mussolini comes to power, has his march on Rome. Hitler has to have his own march on Rome, or march on Bavaria in 1923. Mussolini acquires a set of protectorates all around Europe. Hitler has to come in and take back Austria, take back Spain, and bring them within his control. There's a process by which one leader achieves a victory, the second leader watches it and says, right, they've achieved that, we can match it and we can go further. And I think there's been something like that, something similar at a lower level taking place within Europe and the world over the last year. After Brexit, Trump, after Trump, Le Pen, although not quite Le Pen. But with each victory, that process of the raising of ambition on the right. But another thing that's similar is this. Well, not similar, but another thing that's worth sort of thinking through is this. To my mind, the defining feature of fascism was that it was a party which set out to crush the organised workers' movement, socialists and communists and unions, all of them, without choosing one between the other, but did so in a world where the large majority of people were workers, and so in order to achieve that, had to mobilise a whole bunch of workers behind this demand, as unfavourable as it was to working class people. And that's the core dynamic of fascism. You can just about make the case that there's been a shadow of something similar about the last year. Trump's vote, Brexit the same. That in both cases, if you look at the demographics, the people who voted for either Trump or Brexit, if you take it at the median point, both are slightly more affluent than the average voter. But in order to win the majorities, you have to construct a bunch of working class people and persuade them that their interests are served by, in Brexit terms, the racialised exclusion of the other, and in Trump's terms, again, by the exclusion of Mexicans and so on. Yeah. Now, you can just about see a shadow of the same process, clearly operating at a much, much lower level. But if that's right, then another insight follows from that, which is an insight aimed at the left. The key weakness of fascism 80 years ago was it had to set out to mobilise workers against the working class. And what that always meant that if the left got its act together, its opportunities to do so were always going to be very, very limited. The same equally applies to the present. Insofar as we do suffer, part of the problem of the far right has been this element of racialised voting by working class people. What that should be saying to the left is that's the challenge then to us, to go back to those people and offer them a much, much better, an anti-racist and a working class, a socialist notion of what could be done. That's the way you can underpin that part. You can undercut that part of the far right and turn politics away from the direction in which it's been going.
Thank you.
Christians have been targeted, not quite with the same sort of sense of systematic kind of attack as Muslims have been subjected to, but in Orissa there was this huge explosion of communal violence against Christians in Kandhamal back in 2008, I think, which was absolutely the worst case of mass violence against Christians. And almost as soon as the BJP came to power in the country in 2014, churches were attacked in Delhi, for example. Sikhs by and large don't fall into this sort of category because they're not seen as non-Hindu by the Hindus, that is by the right-wing Hindus. They're seen as part of the Hindu fold, so to speak. So Sikhs haven't ever been targeted in that particular way, certainly not by the BJP. In terms of pushback from workers, none. I suspect even if we say that they got 31% of the votes, that's still millions of people voting for the BJP, right? Millions voting for the BJP. Many of those millions have to be workers, right? And the point about mobilizing workers against workers and so on is that I think that the German pattern is very clear. Workers in isolated locations, small businesses, small industries voted Nazi. Workers in Hamburg, large industrial concentrations, large workplaces stayed with the left, right down to the end. Now this is absolutely critical to understanding why capital began to restructure industry in ways that would depend largely on outsourcing networks, to destroy large units of production, destroy large enterprises, which bring workers together and give them a kind of combativity that Marx always took for granted as the most obvious feature of capitalism. You know, the whole of capital is premised on a working class that is being trained by the labor process and trained in the labor process, right? Capital understands that. By the 1970s, it begins to break up large concentrations of workers. And we're living through what, when we talk about neoliberalism, we're living through the consequences of that complete restructuring or destructuring of the working class. So we don't have the same class any longer. The class that led the industrial combativity of the 60s no longer existed in the 80s. And Thatcher, in some sense, built her program on the ruins of that class. She wasn't the gravedigger of the class, she built her program on the ruins of that class. So there hasn't been pushback from an organized working class in India. It would presuppose a much bigger wave of industrial expansion, large units of production, new kinds of unions, and so on and so forth. None of that has started so far. Yeah. And as for how the RSS handles the issue of caste, very cleverly, because now they've started to de-emphasize caste hierarchy as much as possible, and they're on a kind of almost overdrive to try and recruit Dalits into the Sangh Parivar. Big change in strategy just from the last few years, and it may well pay off.
In response to Neil, when I was talking about convergence, I wasn't trying to suggest that every single fascist, or still less every single conservative, is being pulled at the same rate. I mean, we're in Britain under Theresa May, and Theresa May is perfectly explicable without the analysis I've set out. She is, in that extent, a perfectly ordinary conservative. The Daily Express and Daily Mail during the French elections came out repeatedly in favour of Marine Le Pen. That will not stop them from arguing in the Conservative direction in the next few weeks. Plainly, the extent of convergence depends on the balance of forces in each country. That said, I'd be amazed if people were to look closely at Jobbik and Golden Dawn, and there weren't actually, if you could establish a micro-process where people are discussing urgently, as things which, amongst other things, are electoral parties with between 5 and 10% of the vote, how do we get to the 35-40% threshold that the FN achieved? And people will be discussing that. In terms of Pete in the 1920s, yes, I mean, we need to have a kind of a historical capacity to understand the moment at which you get convergence in the 20s and 30s, the moment which fascism seems to be the thing which all sorts of orthodox conservative career politicians need to jump on, is a moment in about 1929, 1930, 31. We've had the Wall Street crash, and everyone else seems to be incapable of getting themselves out of it. You just have a crash and you have depression, it goes on, it seems that everything's going to be down, down, down. Now that isn't how 2008 panned out. So that does make a difference here. The other thing, is it impossible to have an economic nationalist solution in the present? For the life of me, I don't see why. But what is the economic nationalist solution that fascism had in the early 30s, which the rest of the world didn't? And it was aggressive rearmament. It was spend a lot more money on the military as a forms of kind of military Keynesianism. Now, it's not daft to see that when Trump, for example, was talking about year-on-year increases in the military budget of 10%, as an attempt to do something similar. In their copies of Reich, I think Reich's absolutely the truths he imposes are at such a level of generality they're not helpful. If you want to have a gendered notion of fascism, the place starts at Taverlight, malviolence. And when he talks about these generations in the 20s who were the people who are going to become the fascists, and he goes through their memoirs, obsessively detailed research, and he shows how again and again and again these early Freikorps figures had these fantasies about sexualized violence against women, rape fantasies, again and again and again and again. It becomes a drumbeat. You read it, it's unmissable what he manages to describe. One of the things which you can get from Toda, which I don't think you can get from Reich, is that it's possible for fascism and allied movements to be intense reactionaries in terms of sexual politics, in terms of heterosexual sexual politics between men and women, without necessarily them also going the same way in terms of sexuality, in terms of heterosexual, homosexual, etc. sexualities. And I mean, for me, the recent piece which got this better than anything was the Boston Review article by Daniel Penny. I don't know if you saw it, where he talked about this sexual politics of Milo and the phenomenon on the outright of these people who are militantly heterosexual, fanaticizing around a flamboyantly gay male. And he goes through a whole bunch of articles, including Tafelite, including Sontag, but the one of the links he brought up, which I just thought he was absolutely saw it. I thought was spot on. Was the figure of the MC in the film Cabaret? Don't you remember the flamboyantly gay male who goes on to start the process of leading off a song where everyone sings their song to the virtues of the German Reich? The truth is that there were a number of those sorts of individuals in the 30s, and it's not anomalous that we're seeing something equivalent in the outright today. In that sense, the outright, there is a degree of continuity, but again, the outright is not Donald Trump, the outright is not Bannon. It's part of the totality of American
I think before we can even understand what it means to talk about the state as a machine, you have to start with some notion of the state as an ensemble of organized groups which are thoroughly institutionalized. The machine is the institution is the machine, isn't it? But what's distinctive about the state is that it's the ensemble of all these organized groups, which we can call the ruling class or whatever, but it's more than the ruling class. It's an organized expression of it's the kind of unity. It's the contraction of their unity. And so I don't find anything particularly problematic in the idea of the state posing as a nation. It's like a national totalization, if you like. At one level, or in one sense, it's fictitious because nations are fictitious. They don't actually exist in the way that classes exist. Even as imagined communities, someone has to be doing the imagining. So if you want to see the nation as an imagined community, it's still imagined only by an elite. The active kind of organic intellectuals of the ruling class do the imagining. That doesn't make it anything more than just an imagined community of the ruling class, so to speak. So this idea that Sartre develops in the Critique of Dialectical Reason of the state as an ensemble of organized groups, the rest of society being essentially unorganized, seriality, a massive seriality. And what the organized group does is work on serialities. That's the job of the organized group, to constantly dominate, manipulate, shape seriality in various ways, which is exactly what happens through the mass media. It happens through mass politics, it happens through culture, it happens through ideology, etc., etc. Racism is just one of many of the ideologies that can be used in a very powerful way by fascist movements. And I'd be willing to go along with this. There are family resemblances between conservatism and fascism and so on and so forth. Clearly there are. And there may well be this convergence effect. But here's an analogy I'd like you to think about. This category of post-Islamism, which has been invented to try and explain what happens to parties like the Muslim Brotherhood or Ennahda in Tunisia once they actually decide to contest. Aren't they, in formal sense, abandoning the vision of an Islamic state? Okay, because they're not going to get into power and then immediately declare an Islamic state, because that's not why they were voted into power. So then the idea is that somehow they've abandoned the agenda. The agenda which defines them as the religious right has been abandoned simply because they've come to power through the ballot box. I think that's a serious misreading of what's going on. And that's why I made this distinction between the instrumental conception of democracy as simply using democracy the way Le Pen was using French democracy in order to kind of build a powerful position for the National Front and so on, and a real commitment to democracy as you know, as a value which in fact the right rejects. What unifies a lot of all fascist movements worldwide is the rejection of democracy. It's worth it. Even electoral fascism is premised on a rejection of democracy. So you know, the idea that somehow you know, there's going to be a transformismo going on, some kind of transformation of politics going on simply because they're part of an electoral system and so on. It's a completely utopian idea. I mean, India shows this very clearly because gradually, step by step, they are kind of inching closer to changing the constitution in the country. And it's very clear that we're not going to be able to dislodge the BJP from power if we continue to use these EVMs, these electronic voting machines, because they're massively vulnerable to manipulation. They can easily be programmed and elections can be rigged. I do not believe that the BJP won Uttar Pradesh, the largest state in the country, a few months back, without massive rigging of the EVMs. I just don't believe it. So that's all I have to say for the moment.
In terms of the state, when I've written about the state in those sorts of, because, you know, as well as being interested in theories of fascism, I have a day job as a lawyer, and I have tried to write in various points about that. The concept I've used more than any other is juridification and de-juridification. In other words, you tend to think of the state as this ensemble and as being in more or less the same place. But one of the stories about the relationships between the state and people is that boundary shifts. It's not always at the same point. One of the reasons why Le Pen did so well in France in the last elections is because after 3 years of terrorist attacks and emergency laws, in the sense there has been juridification, the state has taken over much larger parts of people's lives, and that has been made to seem normal and ordinary. And fascism has been able to seem an entirely sensible, continuous solution. You saw it in the debates when Le Pen was criticised about plans to have a veil ban. Well, we've had a veil ban for 2 years. The war on terror created that further extension of the state into people's lives, which then in turn made fascism appear normal. But of course, one of the weird things about fascism is it's a phenomenon that responds to juridification by promising its own form of de-juridification, by promising to take relationships out of the state, by supplanting the state with a political party which will take over some of the functions of the collectivised, privatised, hand-over party which then has that role. So in that sense, one of the role I do think of Marxist intellectuals of the state is to insist in an intelligible way that makes sense to activists and therefore to the vast majority of people, that yes, it's a programme of de-juridification, but it's about the worst one imaginable. We have to have alternative conceptualizations of de-juridification, taking bourgeois state out of people's lives and of creating liberty rather than creating privatised tyranny. The other point in terms of fascism and racism, I mean, I hate this. I don't know if other people hate it, because it's something you hear the whole time amongst activists. People talk about fascism as if fascism is basically just kind of a shorthand to explain the fascists. They're terrible, they're racists. There are two problems with it. Firstly, is it doesn't explain the fascists. Even the far right, what's the first thing that Trump did coming to office was actually to strike out a presidential order enabling abortion rights in the States. Fascism is something which talks a hell of a lot of the time about gender relationships, about control of people's bodies, and to see it just about racism means to ignore a large part of the totality of what fascism is. But also, even worse, well not even worse, just as bad, it's also actually to underestimate the novelty of fascist racism. That was my glib comment earlier about pogroms. A world before fascism was a world that was capable of creating localised killings, towns, deaths in a town of 100, 500, extreme cases, 1,000 people. Fascism, because of the particular class dynamics it unlocks, is capable of setting in train mass killings which involve millions of people dying. So it's not just racism, it's more than racism, and it's a far more extreme form of racism at the same time. And I think, that's why it's one of those sort of common sense bits of activist things we all drift into, but when you encounter yourself too, you have to fight against, because it actually fails to explain the thing that we're against.
Yeah, but the point surely is that racism is absolutely pivotal to fascism. That's all. Yeah, absolutely pivotal to fascism. It's hard to imagine a fascist political culture without some form of racism, whether it's anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or whatever. Yeah?
That's true, but it's also the case, unfortunately, if you spend your time around people who make their life out of fascism studies, is if you're not careful, you end up having about 15 things which are absolutely central to fascism. You can say nationalism is absolutely central to fascism.
Yeah.
And you can say the military state is. And that's why, in a sense, I think rather than saying, insist something's, the key is to see its totality and see its dynamic totality, that's if you see it as a whole, then you can fight all of that.
Yeah, and of course the question is, how does the left build any alternative culture to all of this?
Yeah.
We don't have an alternative culture to fascism. Do we have an anti-fascist culture?
No, we're trying, but...
Bahar is our anti-fascist culture.
Please, no, we're all doomed. On that note, I mean, if there's no more comments or questions, then, I mean, are both of you happy to say 1 or 2 more minutes just to wrap up, or do you want to... Oh, you happy to?
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone else have any announcements or any events that are coming up related to what we spoke about? Or